Welcome to NeoUnrealist. When it comes to running a city, it's really hard in a lot of respects, but in at least one, at the basic core, it isn't. As someone who lived in the worst part of New York City during the late 80s and early 90s, I know firsthand what it's like to live in a place that seemed forsaken by the powers that be. The 75th Precinct in Brooklyn, or East New York as it's colloquially called, the cops that were stationed in the 75th, they had a saying that was written up on a clipboard on their wall in the precinct. You give us 22 minutes, we'll give you a homicide. Now, they were taking that slogan from the local news radio station, which was still is 1010 wins. That if you give us 22 minutes, we'll give you the world. They changed it to make it suit their gallows humor there. So I didn't know that at the time. I found that little anecdote in a 2017 article of the New York Post that looked back at that time in the city when I, contemplated doing this video about Baltimore. So, like I said, I was just a kid back then, but I knew what it meant. I didn't know this. They had that saying, but I know exactly what they meant because look at this circa 1993 Post cover. It says it all. In a 5 square mile patch of ground that I was living and going to school inside of, there was a murder on average every 63 hours. Now, I'm not talking about a murder every 63 hours in the city of New York. I'm talking about in that little 5 square mile patch of the map inside the city. You've got to understand, Brooklyn was so bad back then, the garbage men were getting robbed while they were on the job, picking up garbage by stick-up men. My block, it wasn't the worst one in the world. There weren't that many actual gang members that lived on it, but if you walked 2 or 3 blocks in any direction, you had a serious problem if you weren't well known there. So then something happened almost overnight, really. It was 1994. The city of New York, that year went from about 2,000 homicides in the previous year, which was the last year of the Dinkins administration, to 1,500. 1,561 homicides in the city in 1994. Now, that may still sound awful to a lot of you, but 1,500 murders when you're just coming off years of 2,245 murders in 1990, 2,154 murders in 1991. 1,500 was a big chunk to have knocked off of the total for a year. So back then, maybe some people at the time thought maybe this is just an aberration. Turns out not at all. Because the next year, total homicides in New York City dropped again to 1,177. That's a 40% drop from the peak in just 2 years. Giuliani he only served for 8 years as mayor. The last year he was in office was 2001. And that year, there were only 649 homicides in New York City. Apart from the aberration of the 9/11 attack, where thousands perished in the ruins of the World Trade Center. But that 649 number, it represented over a 70% reduction in homicides in less than a decade. So, and the next mayor who succeeded Giuliani, which was Michael Bloomberg, he had his own problems, but at least in the area of law enforcement, he more or less inherited much of that, part of his administration from Rudy, and he pretty much kept Rudy's policies intact. I can't think of any major thing that he really changed. He may have decriminalized 1 or 2 minor things, but anyway, today, the last year that we have full year numbers for is 2018. And in 2018, New York City, remember, a city of over 8 million people, only had 289 homicide. You got to go back to 1950s America to see numbers like that. That 5 square mile patch of ground that I described to you as the, in the worst precinct in the city, which is where I grew up. In 1993, in that precinct alone, the 75th, remember, there's 77 precincts in New York City. This is only one precinct out of 77. There were 126 murders just in that one little precinct. There are entire cities in the United States that don't have 126 murders in a year. That 5 square mile patch that I just described to you, that little piece of hell, it only had, guess how many murders it had in 2018? 0. I didn't misspeak. 0 murders in 2018. How is this possible? The police, when Rudy took over, they were the same cops. He didn't fire the entire police department and bring in a whole bunch of new guys. It was the same personnel when Rudy took over in '94. What changed is not so much, a lot of people point to stop and frisk, the broken windows theory stuff. And while I'm sure that did help, I don't think that was the biggest factor. The biggest factor was just this fact that the NYPD became the largest and most aggressive police force in America under Rudy Giuliani. They bulked up. I think at their peak, they were up to 42,000 cops in the street. Cops in uniform. I'm not even talking about the civilian employees. They just started locking up the killers. It's that simple. When the killers got locked up and they were all in Rikers or upstate in Attica or Sing Sing with long sentences, they just weren't around to do all those murders. And the focus of flooding problem areas with patrols, they started keeping track. They put in the CompStat system where it flashed up, hey, this area is having a lot of violent crime. They would flood the streets with cops every time a new class would graduate from the police academy. Usually the first thing they would do is send the new guys to the area just to have the manpower in the street and to get their little baptism in fire, so to speak. So that street presence just made it a lot less easy for the crooks who weren't locked up to get away with anything. So the point of this video, though, is to show you that a city with, basically the same residents living in it, nothing changed in 1994. It was the same people living in New York. The police force didn't change. It was the same. The only thing that changed was the mayor just loosened the leash on law enforcement and aggressively went after the problem neighborhoods where the felons were operating. 36,000 cops today in the New York City Police Department. I mentioned it was 42,000 at the peak, if memory served me right. So that's what turned the tide in a city of 8 million. I mean, think about it. 42,000 cops, that's more than 2 full World War II era infantry divisions. No other city in America can throw that many bodies at the crime problem. So the bottom line is that brute force usually is what wins out in the end. Baltimore, what do they have? About 2,500 cops on the payroll. So even though it's a city of only 600,000 people, Baltimore these days has more homicides than New York City, which is a city of over 8 million residents. It makes no sense. How is it possible that a city less than 10% the size of New York City could have more total homicides year after year? I mean, that's the answer right there. I mentioned to you, it's cops. Not enough of them, and way too passive policies and support coming from the top. Remember that infamous Freddie Gray riot when the mayor at the time in Baltimore said that the rioters needed room to destroy? Baltimore is in drastic need of changes in policy and probably a larger police force. Now, if they wanted to match New York City's ratio of police per resident when it peaked out at 42,000 in a city of 8 million, Baltimore should probably have more than 3,100 police on their force. Then they'd be able to take those extra officers and flood the troubled neighborhoods like West Baltimore. Now, because until and unless there is a level of safety, in places like West Baltimore, there's going to be no new investment there. Not even basic businesses. I heard a politician the other day, I think it was Bernie Sanders, complaining that there weren't enough grocery stores in Baltimore to serve the local community to get good food. Who's going to open a supermarket in the worst parts of a city? That research by the Princeton policy advisors shows that is more dangerous than the countries of Central America. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, those places. These are places where Democrat politicians insist are so bad, so unlivable, that the United States should accept any and everyone who shows up in the United States from there without authorization and just grant them asylum. I mean, think about that, people. The Democrat Party politicians say that Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are so dangerous, so unacceptable a place to live, a decent human existence, that we must extend their entire population, theoretically, asylum if it showed up here, yet they're trying to dispute President Trump's characterization of Baltimore as some kind of exaggeration on his part or made up from whole cloth. Even worse, It's being done to protect the politicians who are responsible for these conditions, that are worse than those that they deem worthy of granting a political asylum for citizens of another country. That somehow this is being a good politician if you preside over that. Somehow Elijah Cummings is doing a good job despite 3 decades in office with only worse and worse conditions to show for his so-called effort. 56 homicides per 100,000 people even beats out El Salvador, which is the place where members of MS-13 wind up if they get removed from the United States. I'm serious. American citizens in these blighted areas of Baltimore, they'd probably get more attention from Democrat politicians if they went to Mexico and crossed back into the U.S. and requested asylum. I mean, if they did that, all they'd have to do is cite a credible fear of persecution and bang, you'd have Beto, Cory Booker, and AOC personally holding their hands and leading them to the promised land. It's a sick joke that you got somebody like Al Sharpton of all people down in Baltimore. The next person that Al Sharpton helps, the next neighborhood that improves will be the first one that he ever did. What's he ever done for Baltimore? He was there a few years back when all that Freddie Gray nonsense was going on. As soon as the TV cameras left, he had no use for them. And forget it, if Trump makes a tweet next week about Chicago, that's the last you'll see of him in Baltimore. The Democrats won't even remember that they were upset about Baltimore if Trump tweeted about Chicago next week. I mean, let's be honest, they're not really all that upset about it now. While the people of Baltimore are living like this, Nancy Pelosi, Ilhan Omar, and Elijah Cummings are in Venice, in the finest dining establishments, the Harry Cipriani's, as a matter of fact, in Venice. That's Venice, Italy, people. Pelosi, Ilhan Omar, looks like Sheila Jackson-Lee, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the right there. Elijah Cummings is seated just out of frame, according to the news report. Nancy Pelosi was tweeting her outrage about Trump's statements about the squalid conditions of Baltimore from Harry Cipriani's in Venice, just down the street from the 5-star hotel she's staying in, and all her Democrat pals living high on the hog on the taxpayer dime. How does this junket to Venice, Italy, over in Europe, help the people stranded in West Baltimore? I showed you the devastating graph showing Baltimore being more dangerous than those countries of Central America. Would it surprise you to learn that as of now, Baltimore is expected to be even worse this year? It's on pace to have 340 homicides in 2019 at the current rate. I know people are focusing on the videos, and in my last videos, I think I showed you the piles of garbage, the refuse, the abandoned buildings, the rats that they talk about, in the pictures and the videos. Yes, that's important. But you could clean up every scrap of litter, every bag of trash in Baltimore, and eradicate every rat and pest that you could find. It wouldn't change much. People don't want to work, study, or live in dangerous neighborhoods, no matter how clean and well-ordered they are in terms of appearance. Very few businesses will open in neighborhoods that are not safe. And those that, by some miracle do, they're going to tend to be low-income employment that they offer. Pathmark or Food Lion isn't going to open a supermarket in West Baltimore so long as there is a high likelihood of being murdered, kidnapped, robbed, or burglarized repeatedly. Let alone a higher-end chain. Do you see a lot of Whole Foods in West Baltimore? Seeing a lot of Trader Joe's? You think Google or Facebook are looking to open new offices in the bad parts of West Baltimore? Highly doubt it. If Elijah Cummings wants to change West Baltimore for the better, he should approach President Trump and get his backing to provide funding for more cops on the street in Baltimore. Work with Trump to direct federal law enforcement resources into his West Baltimore area, of his district, to remove the worst killers from that area and get them in the prison system. Only then will things like cleaning up the garbage, tearing down the abandoned buildings that are unsalvageable, and all those other lesser fixes that are necessary, only then will they make any difference. If you do that first and then you do that other stuff too, then home values will rise. The people living there who own homes, at least they'll see their net worth go up. They'll gain equity. That equity can then be used to start their own businesses and help themselves. It isn't a quick or easy fix, but even when the crime does go down, as I described in the New York area before, that area of New York that I described in the previous video, even though it experienced no murders in 2018, it's not by any stretch of the imagination is it a paradise now, but there is a major change. To buy a home in that area today can run someone anywhere from $500,000 to as much as $1 million. There are people living there now who a decade from now, if things continue and the wave of gentrification sweeping eastward from the environs of Williamsburg and Bushwick, if it creeps closer to the border of Queens, you have some homeowners there who might be able to get more than $1 million for their places. In a neighborhood where 25 years ago, hardly a night passed without hearing gunshots. Now, granted, that has a lot to do with the insane New York City housing market, but still, for the people that lived there during the bad old days and bought their homes for under $100,000, that's a massive capital gain. I mean, they're sitting on a lot of value. Something else happens when people own something that suddenly gains value. Suddenly, they start taking care of what they have. They start putting social pressure on those around them to do the same. It starts a virtuous cycle. I mean, after all, how can your property remain valuable if the ones on either side of it are eyesores? Right now in West Baltimore, even if you wanted to and you had the money, you could renovate your house, dump $250,000 into it to make it look better or expand it, make it into a McMansion if you want, if you're that crazy. But what difference would it make if every other house on your block is abandoned or full of crackheads or feral packs of rats feasting on the piles of garbage? If the house across the street front yard is waist deep in trash bags, I mean, you can't get anywhere like that. Fix the crime situation first, then clean up the neighborhood. The rest, with time and the self-interest of the local populace, will take care of itself. No amount of money from the government on wasteful programs that usually get trotted out by Democrats to help impoverished areas, and impoverished people. That's not going to work without the basics being done first. Come on. That's all for this NeoUnrealist. If you want to help this channel, hit like for this video, leave a comment below, hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Click on the notification bell to keep up with newer content, and share this on social media if you want to see the channel grow, because YouTube's not going to suggest this in their suggestions, in their infinite wisdom. If you're inclined to go to the last mile with your support and toss your dollars, your shekels, your yen directly into the tip jar, follow the links below to Subscribe Star, PayPal, Patreon, or just use the green tip pledge button if you're on BitChute. But that does it for the money-grubbing capitalist portion of this video. If you're still here after my diatribe on urban renewal and how to achieve it, another tick towards that diehard achievement for you. Thanks for watching.